Many tutorials show you how to make a synth sound or how to process a synth sound, but usually never both. Today I want to do just that and show you both of them at the same time. So I have this asset sound right here as an example, and that's what we're going to go through. The sound sounds somewhat like this. So in order to make this sound, I'm using Serum, and we actually have a pretty interesting setup right here. You can see we have two oscillators in use, and both of them use this custom waveform, which is generated from a saw wave, something that looks like this and this. And then by going into here and then setting randomize all, this will randomize all of the phases and will get you this kind of gritty waveform. What this essentially does for us in the sound design though is that it takes this click here and kind of smears it out. This is where all of the high frequencies are sitting, and the lower harmonics tend to sit in this part of the waveform. This harsh click is very noticeable in the saw wave, and in this case what we're doing is we're spreading that out over all of this time by making the whole waveform gritty. And you can see we have a copy here which is an octave higher, and this is actually being controlled by this LFO here. This is what changes the timbre of the whole sound, basically, because we're layering this octave up in there. It's just going to add a little bit of extra tone that's going to go in there before we go into the filter, before we go into the distortion, which are the classical key elements of your asset sound. Now, this is not your traditional asset sound in that there is no modulation happening to the filter cutoff. We're only automating it with this particular shape here. You can see that I've drawn in this shape here, and this is what's responsible for the movement of this filter, and therefore for the positioning of this bulge here in the frequency spectrum before it goes into the distortion. So that's what's responsible for the moving tonality of this sound. After that, we want to generate some stereo width, so we're using the dimension and hyper for that. In this case, I'm using both. I like to use the hyper in a very little amount with the retrigger on, so it's very slightly noticeable. And then with the minimal size on the dimension, you can also mix that into taste to, again, get a little bit more of a stereo width kind of feeling to it. It enhances the stereo width of the sound with almost a reverb type quality, but without any of the tail that you would get from a traditional reverb. That's why I really like it, because it kind of puts your sounds into the space. You do want to make sure to do that after the distortion, because the distortion is going to mess with it if you have it before it. Then for a little bit of extra texture, we have this phaser on here, which is just modulating at a very slow rate of 8 bars. And I've just mixed that in on ear to get the slight movement that I was after. This is again one of the sound design techniques that we're using to make the sound a little bit more interesting. And when these come about, for example, the phaser as well as the hyper dimension, the core function of the sound is already established. What the sound needs to do in terms of its modulation, in terms of its energy level, all of that is already established. At that point, you're already talking about details. So I'm running through the patch in a way that may seem very chronological, but actually I made this part first, then I went into some of the processing, and then maybe I went back in here and said, okay, I need a phaser, I need a hyper dimension, I might need to tweak the distortion, I might need to tweak the filter or the waves that I'm using. You're always kind of backtracking into the things that you already established to see if there's details that you need to change. Now, before we get into the processing, I would like to remind you that if you enjoyed this video at any point in time, feel free to give it a like. And if you're new here and you want to see more of what I do on this channel, make sure to subscribe. Another good way to support the channel is to check out some of my products, including my masterclass, for which you can find a link in the description. So then we can go into the processing. Here I'm using erosion. You can see we have an amount and a frequency that we're automating. You can see that the erosion comes in over time for the parts where I need a little bit more high frequency content. So towards the end here, we want a little bit of transition into that. So we ramp up the high energy frequencies that this erosion introduces. And then when we get into the drop, we snap back down to indicate that now the drop is happening and that the listener knows that we're in the next section. And again, we do that in the second part as well. Here it goes up again, And for those that don't know what erosion does, it's basically almost like a bit crushing type algorithm, but it uses a single sine wave, so you won't get multiples of the original frequency that you set up. I actually believe that the correct term isn't bit crushing, but it's sample and hold reduction, which is a different process altogether. But that's not really the scope of today's video. What is important is knowing that it gives that kind of digital distortion that we're after in this case, really crispy high-end distortion. Now, because at some points this modulation is fairly low, and we're getting not enough high frequencies even with the erosion, what we're doing next and what actually came next was this really high frequency boost here. You can see that as the filter opens up more and more, we get more and more into that high energy part that's actually going down. And this is to compensate for all of the stuff that's happening before. So we're basically flattening out all of the high frequencies. Before that though, we had some stereo wave generation, and you can see that's actually fairly little amount. We have the widening itself going down, and then introducing a little bit of extra spread than default. This is normally on 50%, but I've just set bands, minimum frequency and maximum frequency to taste. I didn't apply any saturation in this case. Sometimes that sounds nice, sometimes it doesn't. But for this case, we were already quite distorted with this asymmetrical distortion here, as well as the other distortion that we're using later. Speaking of which, we have to prepare for that distortion, which I always like to do with an OTT. Can see that I'm going pretty heavy on the sound because this is a main lead element. I want this to be loud, I want this to be upfront, and I want this to be strongly compressed. That's why I'm using the full amount of the OTT here. And you can see that we're really slamming it in the output as well, plus 10 dB, which is essentially bringing the level back up to the point where it was before the OTT, so that it then can go into the saturator. And you can see another trick that you can use to increase the energy level is to boost it harder and harder into the saturator, which we're using for the part where it's rising. So by going up, we get more and more distortion, and therefore more higher and higher frequencies towards the end here. And when we're at the maximum, we get the full energy that the sound can provide. After that, we need to do all of our spatial effects. So we have our standard delay and reverb. I believe we have a fairly small reverb in this case. Actually, it's quite decently long. It's almost 2 seconds, and we have a dry wet of under 30. We are using a lot of early reflections in this case, so we're actually going to get more early reflections than the late reflections, which means that we mainly get the stereo widening effect and a little bit less of the kind of tail effect that you would expect from the late reflections. Check out the video that I did on reverb to learn more about early versus late reflections. Finally, we have some final EQing here, which is just to set the tone. We're removing a little bit of the lower frequencies, the lower mids, and then adding it back up in the higher mids. Usually these kind of EQs aren't the final EQ because I don't mix in this project. I will export all of the sounds and mix in a separate Reaper project. The reason why I do that is a little bit convoluted, and I'm even trying to maybe see if I can do a few projects where I don't have to export it, because it does take a lot of time, but it does tend to give me a lot better results in terms of the mixing, because you have to redo everything again from the ground up, instead of in a production project where you already have an idea of what it's supposed to sound like for example with this case where I already have this EQ on here. So this means that this EQ is shaping the tonality of the sound in the production process. So it helps me decide on other production things that I might need to do to other sounds. Maybe the way that I layer, maybe the way that I implement other sounds, other one-shots within this section. But this doesn't actually control the final tone of this particular sound, because that's subject to change when I do the actual mix for this track. Now, in terms of automation, you can see that there's essentially two types. You have the kind of complex form here, which is really there to add the small tonal changes over short periods of time. And then you have the longer overall changes throughout the sections. Another shorter one would, for example, be this, where we're changing the frequency here, but that then later turns into a more long, outdrawn automation from here all the way to here. Now, things like energy levels and automation and transitioning and all of that stuff needs another video on its own. I've said it for almost a year now that I wanted to make this video together with a sample pack. I still haven't finished the sample pack, so I'm still working on that. But at some point, I'm going to go over transitioning and all of this stuff in a different video. For now, I just quickly want to look at how these automations are determining the energy level of the overall sound. So what you can hear is that for the first part here, it's really going to come in. And then for the second part, yes, it's going to change slowly over time with all of these automations that you can see here, and this one that you can see going up here, and the erosion frequency changing. But the main thing influencing the tonality of this part here is this complex automation here, because that's the automation of the filter cutoff, which actually sits before the distortion. So this filter has a lot more influence over the tonality of the sound because it's before all of the effects happening. Now, in my last video, I talked about midpoints and the division rule. In this video, I'm also going to mention the division rule, because we can make a division here. in the sense that this is our section. This is where the lead sits, and this is how big the section is. You can see we have the kick, and then the next kick is starting here. So therefore, this is our section. Section of 16 bars. And then we also have the section in which we introduce the element. So that's this part here. So for the flashing, that's just Ableton being weird. And in this space, where we're introducing it is from the halfway point up until the end point. Remember that the division rule states that we can take our starting point of a section and the end point, and then divide it exactly in half to get the first point of interest. And then we can divide it in half again, and then we can divide it in half again. You can go find this point, you can go find this point, you can go find this point, and you can go find this point, and you could potentially link automations or other things there. In this case, the end of the fill. So we're using this first point of interest here, and we're essentially, as you can see, automating up until this part here. For most of them, you can see, for example, this is the filter opening up, and for this entire part, it's just opening up in one nice motion. The same is true here for the distortion amount. It's just going from -17 all the way to +4 dB in this one smooth motion. But there are some other automations that take advantage of where the fill starts. So for example, this frequency changes right before the fill, and then here it changes again. You have this automation here, which goes down slowly, and then it goes down a lot faster in the fill itself. And even in this complex part here, what you can see is that we have a fill that consists of basically another division, in that this fill is sliced up in half, exactly there. And you can see that one of the points of the automation is also right there on that point where we sliced it up. So we have one at the start, one at the halfway point, and one at the end. And we're just going to go down with the filter cutoff and then back up again to go down, signaling lowering the energy, and then back up again into the next part, into the next section. So that's the whole sound explained. That's everything that I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to show a little bit of everything because I think it's important to show things in context. So as I said at the beginning of the video, a lot of the times I'll just show the sound design, or I'll show an arrangement trick, or I'll show a mixing trick. But I want to show you that a lot of these things are actually interconnected, and the way that you go about your sound design has to do with the way that you want to do transitions, has to do with the way that you want to build the energy, has to do with the way that you have to mix it in. It also has to do with the amount of other sounds that sit in the section that you want to put this sound in. So there's a lot of considerations in the sound design, as well as the mixing, as well as the processing, as well as in the way that you're playing with the automations and effects and transitions and all of that stuff, which are all interconnected, and all of those decisions have to be taken into account when adding new elements to a track. As I said though, I don't mix in this project, so one of the things that I don't take into account is how it's going to sit in the final mix. What I like to do that is I like to bend the mix towards the sounds that I already have, because that way I cannot go back into the production and make changes based on that. That does mean that sometimes I just get a balance wrong, or an element wrong, or a sound wrong. So that means that sometimes I have to do a very steep EQ cut, or sometimes in very rare cases I do have to go back into the production project and make some changes once I've decided that my project is actually going to go into mixing. My standard rule is not to do that, is to say, okay, now the track is finished, and I have to be really strong and say, okay, I don't want to do anything more with the production. I just want to get this track finished and out and released. But that has been the workflow for the last year and a half now, and I feel really, really good doing it that way. So for me, it works. So with that being said, I'm going to end the video here. I do want to make one more special announcement before I go, and that's that on the 20th of June, I will be releasing an EP. This EP contains some of the track that you have been hearing on stream whenever I take a break, or even with some of the mixing projects that I've featured on my stream recently. There's also been plenty of tutorials and sounds and techniques that have been developed for the making of these songs. I did a lot of experimentation for this EP, and that's one of the reasons why it took me so long to finish. I actually wanted to have this finished at the beginning of this year, but that never came of it, also because of some of the delays with my album. That being said though, I'm currently working on the music videos for them, and that's the final thing that I need to do to actually get this finished. But it's already gone to the distributor, and it's already going to be out on services, so I'm going to leave a pre-save in the comments and in the description. That way, if you want to check it out, if you want to already save it to your playlist before it even comes out and immediately start listening to it, you can find it in the link. But that's going to be everything for today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.